Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which forms part of the Northern Ireland Planner Live, organised by RTPI Northern Ireland. My name is Joanna Drennan and I'm the RTPI's Northern Ireland Policy Officer. To begin with, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Landmark Chambers and ARP, for helping to make this event possible. Our session this afternoon is on the theme of connected neighbourhoods. Two major issues have converged in our recent experience, the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Both are highlighting the need for a city of proximities where all essential urban functions are within easy reach by walking or cycling. Among other things, this approach can enhance our feelings of connectedness, improve our air quality, increase our useful time, and transform our streetscapes. We've got three speakers this afternoon who will explore the concept of connected neighbourhoods in more detail. Karen McShane is Managing Director of Kevin McShane Limited, specialising in civil engineering and transport planning. Karen's also a transport advisor to the Northern Ireland Strategic Investment Board. Caroline Bloomfield is Sustrans Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland Director with significant experience in public health planning. Seema Kaler is Principal City Planner at Transport for London with a focus on active travel planning and policy. Before we turn to our first speaker, I'd just like to remind you that if you're tweeting, please use hashtag #NIPlanLive2020. We'll have time for questions at the end of the session, so please do submit them via the chat box and we'll come to them at the end of the presentations. But first of all, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Karen McShane.
Good afternoon, can you hear me okay? Good. I feel a little bit out of place as a chartered engineer speaking to a planning conference. However, I feel that as planners, it is important that you look to other disciplines to hear what we have to say about items such as connecting neighbourhoods. My background, as Joanne said, is as a transport planner, and I've worked and lived in Northern Ireland for over the last 3 decades with development plans and proposals bringing forward new developments in Northern Ireland. But with all these plans that are in place, I'm a little bit disappointed. We've planned for residential zones, employment zones, but have given little attention to the needs to travel between these zones or nodes and our town and city centres. Joanna, in her brief, asked me to say a little bit about the existing planning policies. In Northern Ireland, we don't have that many transport planning policies. We've got a document called PPS3. We had our PPSs before England, and that deals with access, movement and car parking. We have creating places that deals with housing layouts and roads and travel in housing. And we've got development control advice note 15. But none of these have a heavy emphasis on sustainable travel. They're all very much engineering standards. The one exception is Danny Kennedy's document, Ensuring a Sustainable Transport for All, which is very good in setting an overview of ensuring sustainable transport, but doesn't actually tell us how we should do that. So as planners, we need to be able to balance our spatial concepts with our local requirements and our need to travel. But some questions jump to mind for myself. What is travel? What causes congestion? And how do we improve connectivity between different neighbourhoods? All questions that we should be considering when we plan for our future development. To answer some of these, let me summarise the findings of the most recent travel survey for Northern Ireland, which highlights the journey purpose for our daily trips and outlines the mode of travel, as well as summarising the distance that we travel. This is the boring number bit, so let's have a quick look at what it tells us. I know these numbers are a bit small, but they're just more prompts for me. On average, what the last survey tells us is that most people made over 2 journeys per day. 633 journeys were taken in a car per person per year, and that equates in Northern Ireland to about 70% of all journeys made. And you can just see that little symbol there with the car in the middle of the picture. And for me, that's far too high. That's not sustainable. There were 169 walking journeys per person per year, representing about 19% of all journeys. And 47 of the journeys were by public transport, and that equates only to about 5% of all journeys that were made. The remainder being mostly cycling, motorcycling, etc. Looking at journey length, the longest journeys are carried out by train, and in Northern Ireland that averages 19.4 miles. In contrast, the shortest journeys were made by walking, but again, they were only averaging about 0.9 miles. the average car journey being 7.5 miles. Looking further at the purpose for journeys, 23% of all journeys were made for leisure purposes. And for leisure, we mean things like visiting friends at private homes, entertainment, social activities, sports, maybe a holiday, maybe a day trip. 17% were for shopping, 16% for commuting, and 13% for personal business, maybe going to see the dentist or something. In terms of actual miles traveled, 29% of the total distance traveled was for leisure purpose, and contrast that to commuting, which is actually only 23%. 12% was for shopping and 12% for personal business. So how does this reflect our thoughts on travel, and how can we improve the situation for our communities? When we look at things like the school holiday period, how many of us think about how light the traffic congestion is? The perception is that everything moves so much better, yet the actual reduction in travel on the road is only around 15% from studies that we have undertaken at peak commuter times. This small level of change is actually enough to ensure that junctions operate within their available capacity and everything moves well. So how do we achieve this on a day-to-day basis as a starting point? One of my thoughts is that if every car driver left their car at home for 1 day a week, then over the average 5-day working week, that would reduce traffic flow by 20%, achieving what we would see during the school holiday periods. But to achieve this, we have to plan to have those alternative modes in place. Coronavirus has seen a large shift from office work to home working, and this has already seen a reduction in commuting traffic. I know Seema is going to talk from Transport for London later, but I've been keeping an eye on the data from London, and over the last few weeks, we've seen the traffic commuting levels by car in London return to 95% of the level that they were from mid-February. So they're very much getting back to the congestion situation. In Northern Ireland, we haven't quite reached that situation yet, but now is the time when we should be planning for more sustainable travel, resulting in better connected communities. As we plan for our developments, we should not be designing for single purposes, and instead, the policy should be looking at nodes with substantial mixed use so that people can have a range of activities within their node without the need to always travel out from that node. It may include medium to high density residential, institution uses such as hospitals, community facilities, should include entertainment, offices, education facilities, personal services, social services, recreational facilities, retail, maybe faith-based uses. However, that may be the desires to what we want to do. Within Northern Ireland, we have no one company or public organisation that can pull all of that together for us. So we need to start working with the backing of our local councils to ensure that their development plans are created to allow all these things that we would see in what the Australians in Melbourne term their 20-minute city. For these nodes to work, they must focus on urban intensification to meet target density levels that are public transport supportive because of the connection between public transport use and walking. To reduce reliance on the private car, we must include early planning of the more sustainable options.
Karen, we've just lost you a second. Karen, sorry, hold on a second. The sound seems to have gone.
Yeah, Karen, we've lost your mic.
Talk to yourselves, everyone. We'll be back in a second.
Testing, testing, testing.
Brilliant,
Yeah,
we got
you're
you
back.
back.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, don't know what happened there. I'll go back over.
We lost you around about when you were saying about walking and cycling supporting public transport.
Okay, public transport needs to be at a level where it is attractive to users. It needs journey time reliability, and it needs to be affordable. Frequency of services should ideally be no more than 20 to 30 minutes here in Northern Ireland. Otherwise, if someone misses the service, they will have to wait too long for the next one. I'll be interested again to hear what Seema says, but central London has good service frequency, averaging around 7 minutes for some of their bus services in the city centre. And some say, how can you provide such a service in Northern Ireland? Yet, the glider service across Belfast is achieving frequencies of 7 to 8 minutes. These are close enough that people don't need to look at timetables and instead feel they can just turn up at the stop and catch the next service. With improved public transport, we can start to reduce the need for car parking and start to restrict more the use of the car, making better use of the temporary car parks in our city centres. However, we cannot have these car restrictions if we have not planned to provide the alternative sustainable travel options. As we plan for our future developments, we need to be introducing an alternative set of development standards and processes for transit supportive development. This might include things like density or height bonusing opportunities and fast approval processes for those nodes closest to available public transport nodes. These medium to high density nodes should be based around at least 90% of people being able to walk within a 5 to 10 minute time or 400 to 800 meters from that public transport focal point. These nodes should provide good quality walking and cycling infrastructure to public transport, creating additional street or pedestrian connections if needed to keep the walk or cycle distances and safely acceptable. Such access planning should be within a complete streets or smarter streets framework, which should be set out in the development plans. Let us examine some work that has been done elsewhere, linking planning and transportation. The most comprehensive review of connections between travel and built environment that I could find recently is the meta-analysis by Ewing and Cervero in 2010, who talk about the 5 Ds of built forms in terms of how they impact on car travel distances. The first one there is density. The higher density supports more local activity opportunities, higher public transport service levels, and walking opportunities. Destination density is also particularly important. One of the examples of this is Canary Wharf. It's a prime example in London, where the introduction of the Docklands Light Railway provided access for thousands of workers and allowed that whole community to grow. The second point, their diversity of land use makes it easier to undertake activities locally, associated with ideas such as mixed-use development, jobs and housing balance. This in itself reduces the need to travel, with jobs being located near the housing. Third point, there's design, particularly creating interesting places where people want to be, are safe and feel safe. The design should include at the early phase the introduction of the sustainable transport links to allow the new community to be connected to other areas. The fourth one, their destination accessibility, which is the ease of access to trip destinations and developing those activity nodes and corridors. And 50, there's distance to transit, supported by fine-grained pedestrian opportunities embedded in intersection density and street connectivity. By way of example, Ewing and Cervero find that halving the distance to the nearest transit stop is associated with a 29% increase in usable trips. That brings me to walkability. During COVID, I had the benefit of finding some of our local forests in Belfast, such as Beaver to the south and the waterworks to the north of the city. My walking route would take me from Beaver, along the towpath along the Lagan to Botanic Gardens, and then through the city centre to Alexandra Park and the waterworks before emerging north at Cave Hill near Belfast Castle. But despite all the good parklands in the city, it was very difficult to get a good green walking route between those different facilities. Likewise, the cycling routes in the city were not particularly well connected, and we need to do more to connect our attractive spaces both within the city and between our local towns or nodes. For able-bodied people, at some point their journey involves walking, whether that be from home to work or school, from home to the public transport hub, or even just from their car to their final destination. So that walking is really important. Lenberger and Alfonso in 2012 also identified significant economic benefits from walkable places. Their economical analysis finds that More walking places perform better economically. Example, you can have higher office and retail rents, higher retail sales, higher housing values. Residents in more walkable places have lower transport costs and better public transport access, but that tended to be reflected in higher housing costs close to those nodes. Good walkability was associated with higher residential rents and higher sale prices than places with only fair walkability. Residents of places with poor walkability are generally less affluent, and the evidence shows that they have lower educational attainment than places with good walkability. So all of these are reinforcing the need for good walkability. So when we design our new communities, we should look first at the good walking infrastructure. We should then be locating the nodes of most dense development in areas where there is a good availability of public transport, or where there is a plan to introduce new public transport alongside the development. In places such as Amsterdam or Beijing, the councils have provided the transport infrastructure as the first element in the new communities, allowing workers to use the public transport to the construction sites rather than trying to retrofit it once the development is completed. The benefit of improved public transport, walking and cycling is a reduction in car travel, a reduction in the need to park with commensurate reduction in congestion and air quality issues. We owe it to the next generation to plan these transport hubs, such as those developed by the Victorians when they introduced the railways in the 1840s. Looking lastly to existing communities, it is important that we do our best to retrofit walking, cycling and sustainable travel options into the existing infrastructure. There are places where we can introduce new rail stations. We can provide additional lines to increase the existing rail frequency. We can introduce new walking and cycling infrastructure to give a genuine choice to the use of the private car. It is beholding upon all of us to provide this infrastructure. And lastly, my last point today is remember that as a car driver, you're not sitting in congestion. You're actually the cause of the congestion. I hope these comments give you some food for thought and might provoke some debate afterwards. So on that point, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I'll hand back to Joanne.
Thanks very much, Karen. That's a really challenging call to action to improve sustainable transport in Northern Ireland. So it's a good note to pass on to our next speaker, Caroline. Would you like to talk about Sustrans work?
Right, good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. Certainly very interested to hear what Karen was saying, and a lot of what she says would resonate closely with myself. For those of you who don't know Sustrans, we're the charity making it easier to walk and cycle. We've been around for about 40 years in the UK. But although Sustrans has been around for quite a while, I just joined 2 months ago, so I'm really quite a newbie, having just spent the past 19 years with the Public Health Agency. So Sustrans has a vision that the way we choose to travel will create healthier places and happier lives. And this really resonates with me with my sort of public health background. So the 2 strategic priorities we have is paths for everyone. So that's a network of traffic-free paths for everyone connecting cities, towns and countryside. But then the one that I'm going to talk about today is livable cities and towns for everyone, which is places that connect us to each other and what we need, and where everyone can thrive without needing a car. So I just want to ask people just to reflect for a moment about how connected you actually feel to where you live. I mean, do you know your neighbours? Do you use the local shop or park? Do you even have any local shops or parks within 20 minutes of your home? If you have children, are you happy letting them walk or cycle to school? Do you need to get in the car even if you want to buy a pint of milk? And so why is it? But why is any of that important? And I think we've already heard a little bit about the case for change. Obviously, the climate crisis is a huge issue that we hear more and more about. And we know that transport is now the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. Public health and well-being is another critical area. Physical inactivity is the 4th leading cause of global mortality. And we know in Northern Ireland, 50% of adults are not getting enough exercise. We also know that 2/3 of adults and 1/4 of all our children here are overweight or obese. So how do we design our cities that people are able to be more active? We also know that mental health or mental ill health is a growing issue, and that's exacerbated by social isolation and loneliness. More than half of adults feel distant from their neighbours, and 1 in 5 have never spoken to them. Obviously we have road safety issues as well and air quality issues, and we also have growing inequality. In Belfast, for example, about 1/3 of households don't have access to a car, but our cities tend to be designed around moving cars. So those people who are most vulnerable suffer the most inequalities as well. And I suppose we all had a little flavour of how things might be different. During those first weeks of lockdown, there was virtually no traffic on the roads. We had to live locally, we couldn't really travel, we suddenly had a reliance on local amenities, and very much an appreciation suddenly of what we had locally in terms of green space, local walks, and those quiet streets. And Karen referenced the walks and forests that she discovered during that time. So we have, sorry, I think I have missed a slide there, excuse me. So yes, we have a vision for change in Sustrans, that the places that we would have places that connect us to each other and what we need, and where everyone can thrive without having to use a car. So we hope that this will make our towns and cities more livable. So what do we mean by livable? We have sort of 5 key principles or areas, and I'm going to take us through each of these just briefly now. So the first one is that it has social connection at its heart. We want our cities and towns to be welcoming places where people can move and live well together. So that means space for people of all ages and backgrounds to spend time in, getting to know their neighbours, engaging in community life. These should really be encouraging and nurturing local relationships and networks. And we see that walking and cycling can create more sociable spaces, where it's easier to view our surroundings and to stop and interact with people. And that struck me this morning. I go out for a cycle every morning before work, and I ran into 2 different friends, and I was able to stop and have a brief chat with each of them. Can't do that when you're in a car. Now, the goodness of that was slightly undone when a car ran a red light and nearly hit me as I was going across the crossing, but that's a whole other issue. And we see that Edinburgh was the first UK city to join the Open Streets last year, and they close the Old Town once a month, to make the city more accessible, sustainable, and people-friendly. So, and it encourages people to linger on the streets and appreciate Edinburgh's cultural history. And we've had something a little bit similar. Some of you might have been involved in Cyclovia. It's happened over the past number of years. Unfortunately, it's just one Sunday a year. It would be lovely if it could be more often, but it's closing the road between Queen's and City Hall and just opening it up to people to walk, to cycle, to scoot, whatever they want. We know that local shops initially had been a little bit worried, what would that mean for footfall, and actually several of the cafes said they ran out of food because just so many people stopped, because cars tend to travel through and are not necessarily stopping. But we know it's challenging to get agreement on these sorts of things. The Open Ormo campaign, where residents have been trying to promote that idea as well, recently has met with a number of challenges. So the second sort of key principle is that you have most of what you need just a short walk away. We said we should have the ability to meet most of your everyday needs within an easy and attractive walk of about 20 minutes. And I think COVID-19 has really shown how important it is to have access to things locally. And I thought it was interesting, yesterday I saw that Dublin Chamber of Commerce have announced that they're aiming to make Dublin a 15-minute city. Now maybe they walk faster there, but their vision is that every corner of the city would be a vibrant community in its own right, so that the whole city has life. And I thought that was really interesting. They'd seen during COVID some areas became sort of ghost land. I mean, I live in Belfast and I do not have a single shop within a 20-minute walk of my house. And buses are fairly infrequent, so if I didn't cycle, I really would have to drive for most of my journeys. I think Paris has really been the trailblazing city in this regard with their Ville du Quart d'Heure. They really think you should be able to have everything you want within 15 minutes. from your home, and that's echoed as well in Melbourne. I think Karen referenced Melbourne as well. So this isn't a new idea. Lots of cities are looking at this because they really recognise the difference that this can make to the lives of their citizens. So if we look at the third principle, we think that cities and neighbourhoods should have roots and celebrate their own unique character. Enhancing the civic, historic, natural and cultural heritage of the places that we live. Local communities and economies will flourish. I think a lot of car-focused urban design have really stripped away what people feel about that, their sense of belonging to a local community. And we want people to feel at home and proud of what makes their areas unique. And I think a very good example of that is the Conswater Community Greenway in East Belfast. This large regeneration project created a linear park through East Belfast which connects people along the route of 3 local rivers, and they've celebrated C.S. Lewis in C.S. Lewis Square, with a series of statues, and it's a really vibrant part of the city now. Also in C.S. Lewis Square, now it's maybe not as arresting as the big statue of Aslan, but we do have a Sustrans active travel hub in a sort of shipping container. But this square really is at the intersection between the Conswater and the Cumber Greenway, so it's perfect for encouraging commuting by bicycle and for walking. And we do a number of activities here, including cycle training for all ages, including the very popular Ditch the Stabilisers. There's bike maintenance sessions, route planning and bespoke courses for women who are very much underrepresented as cyclists. And people who've taken part in these courses have remarked how it helps them see more of their area and feel feel more a part of the community. And I had a coffee at a cafe in C.S. Lewis Square a couple of weeks ago, and I was just astonished at the large numbers of people walking and cycling through the square, stopping off for a chat, for a coffee. It was really amazing. So the fourth is that it should be easy for everyone to move around in healthily. Because we know that the benefits of walking and cycling and scooting, wheeling aren't experienced equitably, and no one should face barriers to living and moving well. And our cities and towns need to be inclusive for all, and we really need to include a wider range of voices in planning. I mean, I've cycled for 30 years now, and when I turn up at a meeting by bicycle, most people say to me, "Oh goodness, you must be so brave. I could never cycle on the roads." And really, I believe that you should not have to be brave to cycle. We need to design our towns and cities so that everybody can get about actively, whether they're children, old people, people with disabilities. In Belfast, we know that 19% of men cycle at least once a week. That's only 5% of women do, and I think that's a real shame. I think our cities and towns have been for too long designed around the needs of car drivers and how we move cars, and I think we really need now to focus on how we move people. Well, I'll not say too much about London because obviously Seema is speaking next and she will tell us what's happened in London, but I think it's really impressive to see the real focus on creating inclusive, calm, safe spaces there. And we know how important they are if we want to see more people walking and cycling. We have a number of behaviour change programmes in Sustrans. One of them is the Active School Travel Programme, which encourages and supports more children to walk and cycle to school. We do see real results at participating schools, but we know that they could be so much better as well if we had adequate infrastructure. A lot of parents say that they're too nervous to let their children walk or cycle to school. But half of primary school children in Northern Ireland live under 1 mile from school, but 2/3 of them are driven to school. I think that is shocking. And it wouldn't take huge change in infrastructure to get lots more children walking and cycling, because the children say they want to do it. It's just that they and their parents don't feel safe. And I'd love to see safe routes to school being rolled out, and the school streets idea that is being piloted in England at the moment, where the roads around schools are actually closed to traffic at key points during the day. We also have a community active travel programme where we're supporting people in 12 disadvantaged communities in Belfast to walk and cycle as part of their everyday lives. Because we also have a community-led street design, which is part of that, which is an initiative which aims to achieve meaningful changes to street layout and make it safer to walk and cycle, to have more pleasant places to live and move through. So we're going to work with one exemplar location and work with local people to see how they can be involved in actually designing what their community might look like. And then we sort of use this street kit for people to actually lay out what they think it might look like. And then the last principle is that we'd have clean air and green space for all to live and play in. Because we do know that the way our cities are designed really does have an impact on our health and well-being and the quality and length of our lives. People living in deprived areas are less likely to have access to clean air, green space, safe streets, and their health and well-being does suffer as a result. So we do need, whenever we're planning our cities and neighbourhoods, to focus on addressing inequality. Some cities are doing this. Bristol has a parks and green space strategy, first local authority in the UK to declare an ecological emergency and call for urgent joint action to create a more nature-friendly city. And that's something that we would like to see more of across Northern Ireland as well. And we do know that there is support for change. We did a bike life survey last year in 7 cities across the UK. 78% of people across all those cities said that they would support creating space for walkers and cycling, even if that meant taking space away from cars. I think that's critical. And we know here in Belfast, over half of residents think there's too many people driving in their neighbourhood. And we also ran a survey last year, a YouGov survey with 3,000 adults across the UK, and found really that there is huge public support for change to the status quo and reduced car dominance on our streets. 80% of people said that the way we travel should be good for the environment and the health of people who live in cities and towns. 86% felt that it would improve mental and physical health by making it easy and attractive to travel actively. And 85% felt that everyone, including those who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged, should have the opportunity to be involved in local decision making. So we do see there is widespread support for this. What we need, I guess, is strong leadership, brave leadership, because I think the car lobby it has quite a strong voice, and politicians, I think it would be great if they could really stand up and say, we want to move towards supporting people to be more physically active and have more connected towns and cities. And I do think that the role of planners is absolutely critical in this regard. So that is the end of my presentation, and I'll hand back now to Joanna. I'm happy to take some questions later. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Caroline. Really encouraging to hear about the work of Sustrans. We've got quite a few questions coming in. Please do keep them coming and we'll come back to them at the end. But now I'd like to hand over to Seema to hear about the London experience.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me okay. So yeah, good afternoon. Thanks to Joanna and RTPI Northern Ireland for inviting me to speak today. My name is Seema and I work in Transport Strategy and Planning at TfL. This afternoon I'm going to talk about what's been happening in London during the pandemic and some of the work that we've been doing on the 15-minute neighbourhood concept. So I just want to start by setting the scene. Like every city across the world, the pandemic has had a big impact on London. And as you've all experienced yourselves, life was seemingly normal, and then overnight, shops closed, people worked from home, and streets were empty. So I've got a couple of photos I want to start off with just to illustrate how stark the changes in London have been. So this is the Millennium Bridge, or the Wobbly Bridge as some people call it, and this is at the start of the year. And here it is again a few weeks later, and I think late March, early April, and it's empty. So again, another picture here for you, Tower Bridge. This is back in February. So we've got 2 lanes of traffic and people admiring the views and crossing the river like normal. And then here we are few weeks later in April and it's deserted. I don't think I've ever seen it like that, to be honest. And these are fairly dramatic pictures. Yeah, they're focused on central London, but they do illustrate how things were at the start of pandemic in London. So I think this graph probably best illustrates how stark the changes have been. So this shows the changes in bus journeys, underground journeys and vehicle kilometres on London's major roads compared to the same time last year. So during the week of the lockdown announcement in mid-March, travel in London, as expected, fell across all modes. So the greatest fall in journeys in comparison to the equivalent day in 2019 was on London Underground, which is the blue line. And here journeys fell by 97%. Bus journeys, which are in red, fell to lows of about 89%, and road traffic vehicle kilometres on major roads in London fell to 65%. Through late March and into April, as you can see, road traffic began to recover relatively quickly. And I think, as Karen mentioned in her presentation, by the last week of July, vehicle kilometres on these major roads were around 10% down on 2019 levels. Bus and London Underground journeys, however, have remained low. I've lost my presentation. Sorry. Bus and London Underground journeys, however, did remain low throughout April, which this tied into the guidance at the time to stay at home and not use public transport. And this was obviously to allow for space for key workers and those who cannot walk or cycle. From late May, London Underground journeys did start to recover slightly, and by late July they remained 74% below 2019 levels. Bus journeys have been recovering at a slightly faster rate, and by the end of July they were 51% below 2019 levels. By the way, the red line, hopefully you can see the caveat on the graph, but the reason that data is missing is because of the implementation of middle door boarding to protect bus drivers, so we couldn't collect any data. So now I've kind of been through a bit of data quickly. This graphic was put together by some of my colleagues in our urban design team, and I only saw this a few days ago, but I really felt like the 3 phases of response, recovery and new normal were a really good way to frame what's happened in London from the early days of the pandemic to where we find ourselves now, and of course what the future might look like. So some of you may have heard of something called Street Space for London, but for those of you who haven't, this is a transformational programme being delivered by TfL and the boroughs. So, yeah, the programme is very much about creating space for people to safely walk or cycle as the city emerges from the coronavirus lockdown, and the plan is focused on 3 key elements. So we've got the construction of a strategic cycle network, and the aim of that is to reduce crowding on public transport routes, and this is including repurposing general traffic lanes to create temporary cycle lanes. We've also got the transformation of local town centres to enable journeys to be safely walked and cycled where possible. And also we've got the reduction of reducing traffic on residential streets by creating low traffic neighbourhoods across London to enable more people to walk and cycle as part of their daily routine. So the main objectives of Street Space for London are to avoid a sharp increase in car use and to keep London's air as clean as possible to protect health and reduce carbon emissions. There's also a more medium to longer term objective of the programme, which I'm going to come back to, but that is very much about supporting London's long-term sustainable recovery. So helping Londoners to maintain / adopt low levels of car use and increase levels of walking, cycling and public transport. On the next couple of slides, I've got a couple of examples of some of the street space interventions which have been implemented over the last couple of months. So first we had the response period. Back in April, there was very much focus on emergency measures. So these were quite light touch and included things like installing plastic wands to provide more space for cyclists on the road and installing barriers to widen pavements. The top right picture is a temporary cycle lane created on Park Lane, where road space was reallocated on the approach to a busy gyratory in central London to create space for cyclists. The picture on the bottom left is just an example of the pavement widening measures which were rolled out, and they are very much, as I said, to increase space for pedestrians, to enable them to safely walk past queues outside shops, or to provide space in areas where there are more concentrated volumes of pedestrians near public transport stops and stations. So moving from response into recovery, cycle lanes and extra space for pedestrians kind of carried on and still popping up over London. But we also started during this period to see the introduction of school streets in low traffic neighbourhoods. So Caroline mentioned school streets, and there's been quite a lot of those rolled out across London, and they've mainly been borough-led. But we were able to provide data that we held on pavement widths to the boroughs, which helped them identify where there might be pinch points or areas where school streets might be, beneficial. The bottom picture is of a low traffic neighbourhood. So as I mentioned, these are focused on creating low traffic areas around residential streets by making some roads access only for motor vehicles and using things such as planters to stop rat running. And the aim behind this is to provide quieter streets for walking and cycling. So I want to just quickly circle back to the medium longer term objective of street space, which is very much about supporting London's long-term sustainable recovery through adopting low levels of car use and increased use of active and sustainable modes. But the aim behind that is very much to support the economic recovery, improve public health and resilience to potential future waves of COVID-19, and to help Londoners prepare for the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone and to tackle the climate crisis. I know it's quite wordy, but when you kind of frame it like that, the objectives do start to align quite closely to the concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods. So I felt like that was quite a good nugget to kind of put in at this point. So I think, Caroline used this graphic as well, and I know many of you have probably seen it before. And I think I saw this a couple of months ago now, and I think that's when I first became aware of 15-minute cities or neighbourhoods from the work happening in Paris. And now this kind of concept is kind of fairly ubiquitous, and it's a focus of many cities around the world, and probably will continue to be so. I think that's because life, at least into 2021, will see people continuing to work at home and live more of their lives locally. So developing neighbourhoods which are connected and accessible by active modes is going to be critical to avoid a car-based recovery. So it's going to be essential to ensure, like in London or any major city, that the daily needs of people are met within a short walk or cycle. So I wanted to kind of now talk about some of our considerations in the work that we're doing, building on the short-term response and recovery work. So the first point I want to touch on here is data. I think we all know that data is so important kind of in the work that we do. It provides evidence for stakeholders during engagement, but it also helps to drive decision making. At TfL over the last few years, we've developed various active travel data sets and done quite a lot of analysis. And although these were done under a different lens, they're really kind of providing a good starting point to help support our emerging thinking on this area. So there's two examples I kind of wanted to touch upon quickly. So one is the strategic cycling analysis, which some of you may have heard of. So this was developed back in 2017. And this identified the cycling connections with the greatest potential to contribute to cycling growth in London. Many cycle routes have been built on the back of that analysis, but the methodology and the kind of insights we got from it are kind of really useful in our thinking that we're doing at the moment. As well as the cycling analysis, last year we developed the strategic walking analysis. Both of these documents are on our website, by the way. And this includes, the walking analysis includes a range of data sets to help us better understand walking in London. One such data set, which is the kind of map that maybe you might be able to make out slightly in the top right, which identifies where short car trips can be switched to walking based on the characteristics of the trip and the person making it. And again, I think just having access to this kind of information is kind of really helping to frame and steer our current work. The next point I want to touch upon is about the concept of place. And a few weeks ago, I attended a workshop about high streets and town centres in kind of a post-COVID world. And one of the stakeholders said something really obvious, but it really resonated with me, probably because it was so obvious and it was kind of there all the time. But it was that high streets and town centres didn't work for everybody before. So what can we do to make them work better for everyone in the future, so that once you arrive in the town centre, you stay there and you kind of come back? So some of the suggestions from the workshop were about, does the place feel welcoming? Does it have what you need? And then the kind of participants made suggestions. So some of them I thought that were quite interesting were reclaiming neglected corners of spaces in town centres through public realm improvements, adding more cycle parking, signposting to local landmarks, using creative wayfinding to increase local pride, and more flexible seating that wasn't just attached to restaurants and cafes. The final point I kind of want to touch upon is really the importance of local buy-in and support. Again, during that workshop, one of the stakeholders told us a story about some community gardens right in the middle of the city, which were previously only used by office workers. And during the lockdown, local people took ownership, and it was basically just used by those living nearby. And giving local people more control and say on how places can be reimagined, I think is essential to this kind of thinking and its success. And like I said, getting that buy-in. And I think just to kind of wrap up, I think movement is critical. You've got to be able to identify the corridors where maybe interventions are needed. But I think place is also a really fundamental consideration. And from my point of view, and I guess as someone who works in kind of transport and planning, I'm going to be really interested to see what happens, not just with our work and what it takes us over the coming months, but kind of how the rest of the world actually adapts and kind of moves forward with this thinking. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Seema. So that's it in terms of our presentation. So if all our presenters could put on their webcams and enable their microphones, we'll go through the questions now. Thank you all. That was some really thought-provoking presentations there. So we've had loads of questions in, all came in a flurry. So I'll try and pick some themes because there's a few that touch on the same themes. I'll just enable my webcam as well. So I'll tackle. So Karen, I would like to come to you to talk about walking and cycling and socially inclusive, the socially inclusive aspect, because somebody asked the question of, if there are improvements to transport, that generally leads to increase in land values. So how do you ensure that improvements to walking and cycling are actually socially inclusive?
Very good question.
Big question.
Yeah. First one, definitely we have to increase the public transport provision to make that an option. I'm very interested as well that all three of the speakers, despite having a sort of a general brief from you, we've all talked about a 15 to 20 minute city. And we've all talked about how important it is to be able to have that connectivity. Socially inclusive. It's very difficult. We still have quite a lot of regulators on our public transport system here in Northern Ireland. We're very lucky compared to other parts of the United Kingdom. Our public transport service was never deregulated. So we have one transport operator in the form of TransLink that provide the majority of our bus and train services. So they are currently very socially inclusive of making sure that you can bring your cycle onto the train, you can bring your wheelchair access onto the train. They've been changing their bus fleet to make sure that wheelchair operators can actively use that. I think one of the things that I need to think about how we deliver is the connectivity to those hubs. I was very interested in what Caroline was talking about the example of the Ormer Road, and I'd be very keen to see what could we do to increase that corridor coming from South Belfast the whole way down to the city centre, rather than just using a bus lane as a cycle lane. Where's our Conswater Greenway? Where's our Lagan towpath from that particular route? So it's looking at measures of how we can make it easy for people to be able to get into the city centre to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Does anyone else want to add anything? Caroline, I know you talked a lot about access to blue and green infrastructure. Is there anything you'd like to say about that and the social inclusivity aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly we see that where there is safer and more better infrastructure, you do see more people using it. I mean, I always think of my own cycle to work where half of it's on road and half of it's on the towpath. And when I'm on the road, I don't see many other women cycling, and I see very few children. As soon as I get to the towpath, I see it's about 50% women, and there's lots of children cycling. So it shows that where there is safe and accessible infrastructure, it will be used by everybody. Whereas I think when you're just on the standard roads, it's people who are fitter, stronger, generally men, and you don't see the all ages and the all abilities. So I think it's really important that we design our infrastructure that everybody can use it. I mean, we've said for our national cycle network that we think it should be used by a sensible 12-year-old on their own. That's sort of what we're aiming for. I don't think there's many of our roads you would necessarily let a 12-year-old cycle on by themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Seema, I'm going to come to you for this next question. So all our speakers mentioned principles from major world cities like London, Amsterdam, Paris. What do you think smaller cities like Belfast can learn from the major cities in terms of principles for sustainable travel?
I think
if there's one thing that you could implement in a smaller city, what would it be?
I think that concept of having routes that a kind of a 12-year-old would kind of feel safe on is key, and kind of echoing Karen and Caroline. I think cycling in London has seen a big shift over the last couple of years, and we know that segregated infrastructure has had a big impact and kind of builds that confidence. And okay, in a smaller city, you're not going to be able to, you might not have the space necessary to roll that out everywhere, but kind of using and signing quieter streets, I think, is definitely something that a smaller city definitely will have in its back pocket, maybe over somewhere like London, where sometimes even quieter streets are kind of used by everyone and anyone to rat run. I guess, yeah, in a big city, you know, you think, okay, London is, well, I checked, and London's about 8.9 million, and the whole of Northern Ireland is 1.8 million. So you can kind of see the scale there, kind of completely. Obviously, the size of Northern Ireland is a bit bigger, but I think the fact that actually you might have, if something works in London, I'm not saying it's going to definitely work in Northern Ireland, but by tweaking it slightly to kind of reflect the kind of situation, movement patterns, I think, things should, most things I think should translate quite well. If it doesn't work in London, it may not work somewhere else, but conversely, it may not work in London because of the number of people. So I think, trying things, and that's what the kind of ethos of street space is. It's very much around temporary schemes. I think they did that a lot in New York back in the day. I think Jeanette Sadiq Khan's book really focused on that, and I think trying things,
tactical
trying
urbanism
things is definitely kind of the way forward. If it doesn't work, try again, sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely, because people can see in practice how it works or it doesn't work. Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that, Karen?
If I can jump in first.
Karen,
in looking at Northern Ireland, talking about the population, after World War II, there were 50,000 vehicles registered in Northern Ireland. By the 1960s, we had recorded cases of congestion, and we decided to build the motorway network. Today, there's 1.1 million vehicles registered in Northern Ireland, and we're still using the same motorway network. One of my clients, we took him to Barcelona at one stage, and he took me into this lovely pedestrianised piazza and said, "This is what I want for our scheme in Belfast." And I had two reactions. One, I said, "Well, we don't have the weather," is the first one, but we can get over that. But the second one is, I can certainly design you this piazza and this place, but it needs to have stewardship. Who's going to be responsible for maintaining this and keeping it in this order? And then I said, the second thing that I need you to do is to walk 100 metres to the left, because 100 metres to the left, there was a massive roundabout and transport interchange that meant that all the vehicular traffic was taken away from this particular space. So it's getting the balance. Yes, we can give space over to pedestrians and cyclists, but we have to remember that as a rural society, essentially in Northern Ireland, there's a very high demand to use the car. So we have to still design the infrastructure to take that car away. Looking at small examples in Belfast, we have roads like Dunbar Link that Caroline and some of your listeners will be familiar with. which is 3 lanes in each direction. It doesn't need to be 3 lanes in each direction. We can easily take out one of those lanes and put it over to walking and cycling and start to provide this connectivity between the city. The second thing is, if we're cycling to our destinations, I'm hard afraid of leaving my bicycle because so many of them get stolen. We need secure, overlooked cycle parking at the main nodes where we're traveling to. So again, those are very small measures that don't cost very much, but things that we would need to be able to put in to make this more attractive to the users.
No, absolutely, certainly echo that, and we've seen that the infrastructure minister has put in some temporary cycling and walking infrastructure in relation to COVID-19, which is really positive. But I think that there's so much more that we could do. I mean, there is the old aphorism, build it and they will come. We've seen that with cars. You build more roads, they just fill up with cars. But likewise, where we have seen good cycling and walking infrastructure, people are really using it as well and really loving it. So, I think, as you said, Seema, you can trial things out. Not everything will work, but I think if you can do it on a temporary basis, that allows you to do it quickly and build on it if it's successful. And if it doesn't work, well, as you say, take it out and try something different.
Yeah. We've had a number of questions about post-pandemic recovery. I know we're still within the pandemic, but when we're over it at one point, how do we ensure that the positive behaviour change that's occurred embeds itself? So yesterday, Minister Mallon was saying if we just go back to normal, then we've learnt nothing. So actually, we don't want to go back to normal. So what things do you think we need to put in place? Is it financing, policy? Tactical urbanism, as we've touched on. What do you think are the key things that we need to ensure that this behaviour change embeds itself?
I'll kick off to give the others a little time to think. One of the big issues that I have is car parking. When you look at the likes of Bedford Street and other streets where they took away the car parking bays on one side of the road to widen the footpath, I don't think we should put those back. I think if we provide the car parking spaces, people will drive and park in those spaces. When we're designing new housing schemes, our car parking standards say that a 3-bedroom semi-detached house has 3.5 car parking spaces. What that means is that mum, dad and eldest child all own a car, and maybe the second child owns a car. And because they all have that car sitting in their driveway and it's taxed and it's insured, they feel that the perception is it's cheaper to use that car to drive to their destination. Whereas in actual fact, if they were to use public transport, they wouldn't have to pay for car parking at the other end and could probably get just as close to their destination as a car park. So one of my goals and aims is to try and see if we can look at our car parking standards and the spaces that we have taken away to help with COVID. Please don't put them back. Back to you.
Yeah.
Caroline,
I think it is a mixture of infrastructure improvements, but also behaviour change support. So certainly agree, car parking, I think there's some really good ideas there. We certainly need to see more protected cycle lanes. We need to see more footways. And especially around, from my point of view, around schools, how do we ensure that children can travel safely and actively to school? But I think it would be useful to have some sort of behaviour change support as well. So we run a programme in schools, but how can we provide cycle skills training to every P6 child in Northern Ireland, for example? What about adults who haven't cycled since they were teenagers and need a little bit of support? Especially people who are maybe thinking of buying e-bikes now as well. How do we support them? How do we work with health service? You have physical activity referral schemes. Can we work with GPs and others that they refer people into walking and cycling programs to get people more active as well? I think that there's an awful lot that we can do, but I think for me it's about marrying up the infrastructure improvements, the policy changes as well, to support that, and some behaviour change work that encourages and supports people, because people will only do it if it's easy and safe for them.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for in terms of questions. There was one that came in about the principle of public sector delivering sustainable infrastructure and commuted payments. And there's actually, if I could give a plug for one of the webinars happening on Thursday afternoon, we'll be discussing just that question. So tune in then and you should get your answer. So I'd just like to thank our speakers today, Seema, Karen and Caroline. Thank you very much for participating, and our sponsors, Landmark Chambers and ARIP. Thank you all for joining us. And just to remind you, a recording of this session will be available on the RTPI's YouTube channel, so you can subscribe.